Hello, 022 group. This is Colonel Gallagher from the comfort of his home. And I'm going to just go a little bit into Vietnam with you. Kind of like civil rights, it's going to be a large overview. And I'm going to add some things in. I can't get to the details. Once again, you'll have to wait till tomorrow's class, and hopefully we'll get into some details. Okay, where to start? World War II. After World War II, in be exact, September of 1945, the areas known as Vietnam, really Indochina, French Indochina, uh, pushed for its independence. Vietnam had been invaded for centuries by different groups, including China. And then the most recent one was Japan, of course, World War II. The Vietnamese fought fiercely in all their history for this sense of independence. And if that shouldn't make sense, it should. For any American, the word independence should make sense. In fact, in September of 1945, a man named Ho Chi Minh, who was really the leader of Vietnam at that point in time, gave a rousing speech where American generals sat right there and listened, and he started the speech with "All men are created equal." The hope was a Vietnamese support by the Americans. This proved false. The United States, in an era of a Cold War, the context is key. The fear of Soviet aggression clamped down on that pretty quick. And what happened is between 45 and 1950, you went back and forth between what would happen in Vietnam. It was basically handed to the French, and the American administration under Truman and later on under Eisenhower supported the French through financials, okay, in their attempts to maintain and control Vietnam. This is supporting a pro ally, anti-communist. The Vietnamese were determined. They didn't care who they were going to fight. They were going to get independence. They fought the French from 1945 to 1954. A nice little side note to get into is in 1950, the Americans believed that this was what was in place was if I had a row of domino theory was in place, that the fall of Vietnam would then open up these other falls. The dominoes would keep falling, and next thing you know, Southeast Asia would be totally communist. And in 1950, would also open the Americans' eyes, of course, is Korea. In the Truman administration, they said, "Aha! Now we know it's a Soviet march across the region. This could not be further from the truth." The Vietnamese independence, I go back to that word, so I'm going to keep saying it. They were not going to be controlled by the Soviets. They were not going to be controlled by the Chinese. They wanted independence once again. And so this is really a poor assessment by the Washington, D.C. administration. I don't care if it's Truman, I don't care if it's Eisenhower, we can just keep kicking the can down the road. Vietnam is going to be handed over to each president. Each president then coming into office, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson is the best one, said basically, I'm the president, Vietnam must be saved. I will not see communism, rise throughout Southeast Asia. Not on my watch, basically. And so each president made a total commitment to this, but the commitment ended up getting greater and greater. Okay. By 1954, when the French were removed completely, they were defeated at Dien Bien Phu. And I'm laughing because when you read about it, it's just unbelievable, that anyone's gonna say, yeah, this could be won. That's my assessment. I'm sitting in the Washington D.C. office, and in reality, the Americans now had which way do we go? Vietnam would be divided into two parts. North Vietnam would be communist, South Vietnam would be non-communist. And the American administration in D.C. began to support leadership in South Vietnam. That was not a very smart move. These were dictators. These were foreigners to the Vietnamese folk. Bao Dai is one of my favorite ones to read about. Bao, Dai. He was more pro-French and less Vietnamese, so you can imagine. And he did all kinds of weird things, and I don't want to get into that. But this is the pattern that we begin to develop, and we're supporting a really weak government. And this is this grand lesson of don't do this kind of a thing. And down through history, several people have made wonderful, good assessments of this. Uh, and I can name tons of them, but I'm not going to try to get into that. Anyway, from 54, the next thing I'm going to jump 10 years all the way up to 1964. And what happened in 1964 is called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. There was an incident that took place called the Gulf of Tonkin incident, where American gunboats were supposedly fired upon. Now, you have to be very careful with this analysis, and you have to do some good reading. And what you find out is there's two separate reports supposedly making it into one incident, which means it's doctored and it's not quite right. And the man you have to look at, this is when Lyndon Johnson's the president, and he came in off saying, I will not see Vietnam go the way of China. This is the American commitment. And the grand lesson, really, in this case is the United States chose to put its great military might into a region of really no vital interest. And that should be the lesson. Maybe we have learned, maybe we haven't learned. And so the whole idea is the Gulf of Tonkin incident gave Johnson the right to go to Congress and request complete support for this escalation into Vietnam. The numbers of soldiers moving in began to grow under tremendous amounts, to where you go from, maybe 100,000 to 500,000, to a million or more. And the idea then became, if we do more, if we put more men in, if we change the leadership, if we bomb more. I mean, the list went on and on of how can you win this war. In other words, the Americans came to the conclusion in D.C. you could win this. It's winnable. You had some that stood up in D.C., like Wayne Morse, Morse, who was a senator who said on the Senate floor, you can't win this. Now, that was unpopular for him to say that. But he was adamant about this, and he didn't believe the Gulf of Tonkin incident was accurately portrayed, which he was right whenever you look backwards in this. And then the other one was George Ball, who is an advisor for Lyndon Johnson. And I have the transcripts, and it's interesting to read because Ball says this is not going to work. And it's partly because you have a very weak government. It's partly because of the way the war was fought, the guerrilla type warfare, and partly because the Americans were in a limited sense of engagement. And it was always the Americans, if you remember World War II, were big war, overwhelming force. And so then with the lesson of Korea is you don't want to widen this. Okay, because we had that lesson, remember, with MacArthur and so on. And if you widen this war, now we're talking about what? Direct contact with the Chinese, direct contact against the Soviets. That's the big no-no of the Cold War. This became a very fruitless venture. And in the end of it, if you think of it today, what happened to Vietnam? Well, it's independent, it's communist. Okay. And so the American lesson really, and I like what some of the like Newt Gingrich had a great quote. He said, "We designed a war to lose, and we lost it the way we designed it." And when you sit and do this analysis, it is exactly right. And the other one is George Herring, a really good historian, who said that the American government in D.C. said this is an apparent march of the Soviets across the continent, and that's what we thought. And this couldn't be further from the truth. And so this localized conflict blew up into something much larger. And because of that, the Americans lost a lot of credibility. And so Vietnam was always this test case about vital interests. And the lesson to me is always perplexing because here we just finished with Afghanistan, which is 20 years old. And I don't know what the outcome of it would be and will be. But I know one thing, it's this problem of you got to be careful because when you talk about these types of wars, you got to have an end game and an objective that's clear. There was none, and it's muddy. And what gave us this assertion and why historians are so adamant about this is you have to read the thing called the Pentagon Papers that came out in 1971. And once these were released, it opened up the eyes of a lot of Americans. They eventually get published, and it taught one thing: the American people had been lied to, and that the war had dragged on with no clear understanding. And what really broke the back of Lyndon Johnson's support in Vietnam was 1968, the Tet Offensive. That if the enemy had been defeated, how could the enemy launch such a synchronized, multi-formed attack on military bases throughout South Vietnam? Now, the weird part is the United States won the Tet Offensive, but in a way, they lost the war. And it was Tet that caused this downfall. Walter Cronkite was a very respected media for CBS News anchor, said that he even on TV said this doesn't look good, and that the support for Vietnam most likely wasn't winnable. And Johnson's reply was, "If I lost Cronkite, I've lost middle class America." And so this proved to be an exasperating, frustrating experiment in American military power. And the Soviets would find this out in, ironically, Afghanistan from 1980 to 1989, wouldn't they? Because the Americans supplied those rockets and everything else for the CIA to the Afghani freedom fighters, which one of them was Osama bin Laden of the Mujahideen. It's weird when you start reading this, isn't it? But there's always a lesson. We just don't learn it. It's normal. It's almost like being a teacher and all the other people in the classroom are at their desk just like this, sleeping along. And those people sleeping happen to be our government officials or military people making the military decisions. We should learn our own history, and we should be very cautious with it. You got to be careful with this. And so there's a great lesson coming out of Vietnam. It is not the soldiers' fault. Let me just tell you that. Some gave all gave some. And those that went in to fight Vietnam believed firmly in what supposedly the point was. But then later on, you have a lot of conflicting evidence. And feeling like you've been lied to is not good. And this is where you begin to see the downfall of it. This is directly connected, by the way, to the presidency of Richard Nixon, 1968 election, where he said he had a secret plan to end the Vietnam War. I love this part. And one of the news reporters said, "Well, tell us." And he goes, "Well, if I told you, it wouldn't be a secret now." And isn't this awesome? We believe anything, don't we? It's like Santa Claus, Easter Bunny, no wonder. And so when you think about this, it's good to do research. It's good to think. And I hope that someday some of you are in the State Department or some of you are in a position to make decisions where it makes sense. Okay. Always assemble all of the possible material at hand, make an informed decision. Okay. But thank you. You guys take care. I'll see you tomorrow. We'll talk about Vietnam. It's going to be a 2 day process. There's a lot to go into. I'm leaving a lot out here, but that's the synopsis of it. Okay. Thank you. Bye bye.